Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv. This is the Sunday show at Hromadske International, the only prime-time television program explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm. And that's what we have prepared for you tonight. Ukraine's President Zelenskyy's 14-hour press marathon. We talked to journalists who were there. What do Ukrainians living in the conflict zone think about the withdrawal of troops? Giuliani associates connected to Ukraine arrested in the US. What should we know about them? Parliamentary election in Poland. The ruling Conservative Party in the lead. Hromadske for the 5th year partners with Riga Conference. Our exclusive interviews with Vice President of the Center for European Policy Analysis, Edward Lucas, former NATO Deputy Secretary General Alexander Weshbo, Lithuanian Foreign Minister Linkevicius and political editor at Bild Julian Rybke. The longest ever press marathon given by any president had taken place here in Kyiv, just some kilometers from, not far from Hromadske studio. That was by President Zelenskyy, who for 14 hours in a row was answering the question of more than 300 journalists. And we have with us our colleagues who had been there. That's Andrew Roth, who is the Moscow correspondent from the Guardian, and Anna Myroniuk, who is a staff writer from Kyiv Post, our great colleagues explaining also Ukraine in English. And of course, and I understand that as an American reporter working for the British paper, your interest is all about the story about the Trump and Zelenskyy, everything about after that. But we want to give let us know, how did you see, what is your impression, what did you find out coming here, to being present at this event?
I mean, for me, coming in for the event, you knew that it was going to be something unusual or kind of unorthodox. It was almost, I guess, a little bit of a circus, for 14 hours, kind of people gathering in this food court in downtown Kyiv. And I mean, part of the idea was really to create this kind of spectacle of transparency. So going in, you came in with kind of a grain of salt and you understood that it's sort of a show. On the other hand, I mean, you do have to say that physically it's impressive, and it's good that there was an opportunity, at least for journalists, to directly ask questions to Mr. Zelenskyy. That's one of the first chances that a lot of journalists have had to do that.
And as a Kyiv-based reporter, were your question covered? You've asked the brilliant questions on the mayor of Odessa, who, according to the investigation also done by Hromadske Investigative Units, leads to had a Russian passport and all about criminal situation there. But were you satisfied with the answers and all other answers?
Well, it's tricky because my opinion is that Zelenskyy had a problem with addressing questions, obviously, sometimes. Because sometimes he trying to be transparent, trying to be nice, trying to be perceived as a nice guy who is willing to answer, to be transparent and open. Sometimes he was even aggressive and also, I would say, even rude. Because, for example, some journalists, I didn't experience that myself because he addressed my question with problems. I'll tell about this later, but other journalists had a difficulty with him when he was attacking them with, for example, saying, well, try to walk in my shoes. I didn't even have time to do haircut because I'm so hard-working president, and well, why are you asking me, because I'm that busy and I'm that tired of everything and stuff. So I think the problem is that he didn't want to answer certain questions, and instead he was asking journalists. So for example, he was asked a question and he didn't know how to answer, so he would say, well, I want to ask you a question instead. And I think that is kind of distracting for people. He was trying to win time, I think. while he's asking a journalist a question, he can think about what to answer on the question asked. My question he addressed, and he said that he's not a friend of a mayor of Odessa, Gennady Trukhanov. He said that they don't have any relationship but working relationship. And I think that, again, I needed to ask him twice about whether they discussed corruption, because he admitted that they met at Bankova, and he tried to avoid my question on whether they discussed corruption. So yes, as I said, I needed to ask him twice. So he finally said that they discussed everything. So that was the answer.
Andrew, and you were in the very end of the line, and you also were talking about Trump, and I guess that was a question which had been repeated for many times.
Right. I mean, that was a topic that, most of the American reporters who are here in Kyiv right now are very focused on that, and other foreign reporters too, because in the United States, that's the biggest topic right now. The topic had been brought up, but the thing about discussing that with him is that, there's a difference between having, a 14-hour press conference and really being ready to engage with every question that you're given. And I think that in terms of, discussing Giuliani, the phone call with Trump, etc., that was a topic he did not really want to discuss that much. I mean, that had a kind of set answer.
I would have to clarify, everybody who'd been in this studio or talking to us from DC had given the only advice to Zelensky is no comment on this topic, because anything he may say would be bad for Ukraine and can't be considered partisan. So how do you think that in the end, out of the all answers of the foreign reporters about this, what we have in the end, the final, how do you understand his position?
I mean, I think that exactly is his position. It's basically to avoid any kind of controversy on that. It's funny, there were so many foreign reporters here, but I really think that this press conference was more about addressing his problems at home. It's for the last couple of weeks, there has been a lot of criticism about him, and there has been, a couple of, I guess, bad news weeks for Zelensky outside of the call with Trump. Between the IMF and this, basically stalling of the IMF, looking at Kolomoisky and PrivatBank, looking at the Steinmeier formula and some of the response to that, and also the fact that a lot of people see him as not the most open president to the press. So he was really trying to address that problem with this press conference, and that's what he was focused on.
So how about the other questions? Of course, we think the same as the question of Trump for dozens of time. There was a question asked about the Normandy Forum, about the negotiation with Russia in different format. So where you think, what we understand as a society after that?
I think I totally agree with Andrew. I think the problem is that he wanted us to know that he is somewhere in the middle. He stands in between of yes and no. So that's basically what he was saying. I think everything he said can be interpreted in different ways. So it's a matter of how you perceive these things. So I think he was indefinite in everything he was saying, and that is his problem, because we didn't, as a society, as a journalist myself, I didn't get what he wanted to say in many instances.
Right, if you read, foreign press reports too about what he was doing, there's no line. There's no single idea that all the sort of reporters kind of caught on to. There's no lead really about what this press conference was about, right? What was the most important line? Because for me, it's kind of difficult to say what news he made in 14 hours.
So we get a lot of news, but for instance, in our case, it was quite obvious that he was very strong on the humanitarian part of the Donbas, as having it as a strategy to end the war. Which was also very, let's say, before, especially within the last weeks, there were some of the protests against any kind of resolution with Russia, and he was just begging this idea that there is no way, rather than we do some concessions.
Right, that's important, of course, understanding his approach to the war and how important that is for his administration. He said that in the first, I think, hour, right, or even in the first 15 minutes of the press conference. That was the main line that he wanted to get out. But in terms of hard facts of what has changed, what more we know basically about the Steinmeier formula, or about humanitarian actions in East Ukraine, or about a bunch of other issues about Kolomoisky. I think that was not completely addressed in the press conference, and it left a lot of questions, despite the fact that he was sitting there with many journalists for 14 hours.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think 14 hours, and we don't have certain answers on plenty of questions.
Which are, for instance, because I've heard all 14, I've heard every single answer, got quite a clarity on some of them. Not some vague answers were, but some were quite clear. At least you understand where the guy stands.
Well, for example, Kolomoisky case, I think it's interesting because he was, in the very beginning, he said something like, we need to negotiate, and I would have if the society gave me a chance to do so, because when I posted this photograph, when I'm sitting at Bankova with Kolomoisky and the team, everybody got, well, furious and started criticizing me. So he was like, the society doesn't allow me to hold these negotiations with Kolomoisky, and I would have if I had a chance. That was his first opinion. And then he said something completely different, saying like, well, we shouldn't pay any money to Kolomoisky back after nationalization of PrivatBank. So I don't really get, does he want to negotiate with Kolomoisky, or does he want to, he also said something like, I don't put any pressure on the courts, and I will call the judge or something like that only in the interest of Ukraine. It is also quite a tricky phrase, in the interest of Ukraine. Everything can be in the interest of Ukraine. It's like very, again, it's a matter of how you perceive this phrase.
Right, if he said I'd be acting not in the interest of Ukraine, that would be quite surprising. So, what else can he say?
I would probably mention one remark. We had a short video, which we even didn't mention, I guess, for us. It was not that outstanding out of the whole conference of the press marathon, but some of our LGBT activists pointed out some particular moment we would like to show, because there were some people coming to the place and yelling. So what we've been pointed out, that it was the first time the Ukrainian president openly defended LGBT, and we have this short clip which was on the, let's say, margins of this press conference.
Почему вы не дали ответ епископам и всем нам, что остановите вы программу комитета 300 Сороса по распространению проклятия разврата гомосексуализма? Остановите ли вы легализацию проституции, аборты? Или вы будете продолжать курс Порошенко, шестерки Сороса и комитета 300?
Я не знаю пана Сороса, не є його шестіркою. Тому я не можу продовжувати робити його працю, тому що я до його праці не маю ніякого відношення. Я не займаюся легалізацією проституції, чого в країні немає. Легалізація будь-чого в країні може бути тільки через законодавство України, через зміну законодавства. Це значить через Верховну Раду України, через прийняття закону. Про людей з нетрадиційною орієнтацією не хочу вам нічого поганого зараз говорити, тому що ми живемо з вами в відкритому, вільному суспільстві, де кожен обирає мову, якою спілкується, національність і свою орієнтацію. Залиште ви вже цих людей в спокій, Господи.
But I guess let's move to the different, because the marathon was just some kind of the opportunity to ask. The story you probably working, first of all, this is the Ukraine-US relations after the scandal, after the everything we got to know with this quid pro quo deal, which hadn't happened. So while being here, what do you think is at this stage is the most important in the case of Trump and Zelenskyy?
I think to me, it depends on whose perspective you're looking from, really. I believe, personally, as somebody working in Kyiv right now, that this is mostly a story about Washington and the way that Washington, D.C. works. We're talking about American politicians or people connected with them coming out, and the way that they can kind of make money using their name or power, and the way that there are some Ukrainian businessmen who are willing to pay for that. I think that in terms of the Ukrainian side, I think what's most important is it's the kind of first test for Zelenskyy's team, and to see a little bit from the inside about how they managed to deal with one of the most difficult situations that you can imagine as the new president of Ukraine. You're dealing with hostile power in Russia. You need U.S. backing, and you can't anger the president, but you also have to worry about the elections coming up. And to my mind, I think that we should be impressed to a certain degree with how the Zelenskyy team has handled itself. Not all the information has come out, but they're balancing on a very kind of difficult situation, and from the transcripts that we've seen from the telephone call and the way the case is moving, we've seen them kind of stand their ground so far. So I think that that's most important to me from the Ukrainian point of view.
And this week also we just this Friday, the former ambassador to the US, of the US to Ukraine had given a written testimony to the Congress, Maria Yovanovich, who had been awkwardly pulled out just few weeks before she had to end her term. You've been working also here. I guess we read this testimony, and I think we're not repeating it because there is nothing mind-blowing there. Just apart from openly, there was a good diplomat who tried to protect, to work for the state. But what do you think? It also brings to the table her testimony, and also how do you think that? What did you find yourself in this transcript?
Well, I don't know. I don't think that her testimony was anyhow revealing or bringing some kind of, explosive information regarding Trump and this scandal involving the Bidens and Burisma and so-called alleged intervening of Ukraine into 2016 elections. I think everything she said, we kind of knew before. I mean, journalists probably.
Journalists based here in particular.
Based here, yeah. Probably. That's why, to me, it didn't kind of ring a bell that, well, that is something that I didn't know. So, I don't know. To me, the whole situation is quite difficult, and I agree with Andrew that I think Zelenskyy is standing on a sick ice, and if he makes wrong move, that can be critical in this condition and in this situation.
What also her testimony is adding to the story?
Yovanovich's testimony. I mean, what's important to me in that testimony is, one, I still think, despite us knowing this, it's still the fact itself of a former ambassador to Ukraine standing up and saying that this is, how the embassy and how the State Department was working is important. And two, I think, was one line in it when she said she went back to Washington, D.C. and said that the Deputy Secretary of State told her there was a concerted campaign against you. To me, that begs the question, what concerted campaign, and can that person tell us more about it? The person who said that to her is now the nominee for the ambassadorship to Moscow. So this is a person who's going to be in this part of the world coming up. And, to my mind, it moved, I agree that it didn't move forward the story too much, but I think the spectacle of it was important.
So to finalize, I would say, as a foreign reporter, with having Ukraine in the US headlines all the time, but just the name, somewhere, what are the things for you are the most important to know here still? What we still have to, investigate, find out, ask people here, or you think it's still what we can investigate in Ukraine?
No, I mean, I think the most important thing is there's a lot of information about how this happened that we don't know about yet. The difference between the Ukrainian leadership and the American leadership right now is actually that Zelenskyy's team has very good discipline in terms of what they're talking about or not talking about in general.
It's strange to hear.
It is very strange to hear, and it's unusual situation, but there's about maybe 10 or 15 people who can really put you in the room or tell you about these conversations that took place between Yermak or Bakanov from the SPU, or Bogdan, of course, or Shafir. And the most important thing is to try to get their side of the story somehow and to figure out, because they can fill in a lot of details or at least confirm what US officials are saying. So that's the most important thing. How to do it, that's another question.
So thanks a lot for this discussion. There was Andrew Roth from The Guardian and Anna Myroniuk from our colleagues from Kyiv Post, so follow also their publications. And so thanks a lot for being with us. But I guess also to finalize, a lot has been for the Ukrainian reporters interested in the whole discussion with Zelenskyy. It was about the war and the end of the conflict with Russia, which is somewhere far away. But we still in the situation when most probably there would be a meeting between the presidents in this autumn. I'm speaking about the President Zelenskyy and Putin. But there is a lot of discussion how the Ukrainian troops should behave and whether they should be withdrawn, especially on the contact line. There was a particular 2 towns named on the contact lines, Petrovske and Zolote. And one of our correspondents, Ivan Bukhtiyarov, had spent the whole week in Zolote, and other journalists are traveling there. And we're giving the voice, we are giving the voice to the people who are living in exactly there where the things really happens.
Zolote 4 is against the withdrawal of Ukrainian armed forces.
There are issues, but all in all, the military is Ukrainian.
Your people will soon come. I say, who are our people? Give us details. They'd come from the other side. We'd leave and they'd come. In September last year, I said, just like when you came in September, you'll abandon us and leave. And we'd be...
We'll become nobodies.
Why are you afraid?
Because we are afraid. Why don't they stop firing? They can't just stand, otherwise Makhnovism will prevail. One group leaves, another comes. Nothing will get better, only worse. Where can I go?
I have left Peromaisk already. Where can I go further? I have left Peromaisk already. My house was destroyed. Should I just be waiting for the same thing here? Where would I go?
I want him to tell you how he'd give you buses. I want him to organize housing for you.
You consider this issue seriously now. Whoever needs evacuation in case of withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from here, Zolote, and nearby villages. When you require evacuation, let us know the addresses, house numbers, and names of the people we would pick up.
It's not like the entire Zolote will be left behind with all people leaving and Zolote given over to the other side. This won't happen. National police will stay here and work. There is a functional police department here. We also have a working rapid response team, whom we are further reinforcing. We are adding 19 extra national police staff. It's a lot.
How many are there currently?
Currently, there are 17 police officers here.
We, Zolote 4 residents, are obliged to address you as the guarantor of Constitution with a demand to stop immediately the withdrawal of Ukrainian armed forces from the current positions.
Позиції, які вони займають на сьогодні.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Золоте – це Україна! Україна – це золоте!
Tell the president and everyone, please. People do not want to live in a grey zone. These people are Ukrainian, living in Ukraine. They want Ukraine to stay here, the military to stay here.
Осталась Україна, остались ЗСУ.
This week, two Rudy Giuliani associates who helped him on Ukraine were charged with campaign finance violations. Prosecutors said that Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman were part of a conspiracy to funnel foreign money into the US elections. My colleague Tetiana Kozyreva had been following the stories in the name of Fruman and Parnas were exposed this year for BuzzFeed, and now she's in studio, so great to have you here.
Here.
So this is the story of the week on top of the scandal with Giuliani and Trump, but you've been on this story for a while. You've done with the colleagues the long investigation, in particular on Fruman and Parnas. Talk to them. Now there is a lot of press in the US, but still, from your finding, what is the most important to know about those two people?
We published the story in the end of July, and that was like the story was published 3 days before the call that Trump made, and he talked with Zelenskyy. So, and I think our story mentioned in the whistleblower complaint, and the story was about two Ukrainian, basically two American businessmen who had roots with Ukraine, right? One of them were born in Belarus, like they both were born in former Soviet Union. But one of them was born in Odessa, the other one in Belarus. The most critical and important thing to follow in the story is we basically exposed that those two guys were traveling back and forth from US to Ukraine, and they were managing communication between Giuliani and three Ukrainian prosecutors, Shokin, Holodnytsky, and Lutsenko.
So that's probably, we need to explain that Shokin was that exactly prosecutor who had been fired after fired during the time of Joe Biden, but in Ukraine he's considered to be the very corrupt prosecutor. Nazar Holodnytsky is the prosecutor, special prosecutor for anti-corruption, and Ihor Lutsenko is the previous prosecutor close to former President Poroshenko. Yuri Lutsenko, yes.
And 3 of them were helping basically to collect dirt on Giuliani, right? Three of them were basically helping Fruman and Parnas to collect dirt on Biden and pass it to Giuliani, basically, right? So instead, their only interest was exposed, right? They were making a deal, they were trying to make a deal, which basically saying that US will sell liquefied gas to Ukraine. And they have found the company in US, and they had basically communication with the head of Naftogaz, the state company, who was supposed to buy this gas, liquefied gas from US through their company. So they had like their commercial interest, right? Instead, they were basically collecting dirt on Biden and was involved basically in communication with Giuliani, who was intensively pushing the story about Ukraine influence on presidential campaign into 2016. So the thing is that Trump now is denying any contacts with them. He said like yesterday that I don't know who are those guys. But in real life, and the other thing is that Parnas was telling us that Giuliani is basically some kind of a godfather for his son. So apparently that Fruman and Parnas had long-term ties with Trump himself and his lawyer Rudy Giuliani. Last year in Ukraine, basically Parnas and Fruman was meeting not only with like 3 prosecutors, they were also meeting Ukrainian oligarchs. One of them went public and claimed that those 2 guys are basically fraudsters. This is Ihor Kolomoisky, who had the meeting with them in Israel, and he said that they basically demanded money and they asked them to organize the meeting with Zelenskyy, right?
So that Giuliani should meet with Zelenskyy. It was exactly that meeting which was skipped.
Yes.
We're speaking about this meeting in the end of spring for the inauguration, where we first of all, for the first time, heard this story about attempt of Giuliani to approach
Yes,
Zelenskyy.
and basically Kolomoisky was the first businessman / oligarch who went vocal on them, and he basically claimed that they're fraudsters. And next day, Fruman and Parnas filed 2 lawsuits against Kolomoisky. One of them is criminal complaint, and which is saying that basically Kolomoisky was frightening them, and another one is civil complaint, and it's saying that Kolomoisky ruined their business reputation, and they demanded a lot of money, even for Kolomoisky. And the thing is that Giuliani went publicly, and he was basically protecting Fruman and Parnas. So that was exposed, and it was everywhere. And the thing is that now we are seeing this indictment where prosecutors, American prosecutors, are saying that there was a foreign individual, number 1, and he is Russian, and he was giving the money to the company with the name Energy Producers, right? And this company was giving the donation to the Republican campaign. Basically, it's illegal action because foreigners cannot donate to the political parties or be involved in any kind in US elections. So it's illegal action, and they basically receive those money from foreigners, and they use it to buy the influence in White House, basically. Right? They were donating to congressmen, they were donating to political parties, to,
Again, to explain that that meeting didn't happen, so later all further communication with the Zelensky and Trump, an attempt of the Giuliani to, raise the issue of, for instance, Biden, and something went in through the other channel, because that was the initial channel, as we understand. But do you have any information, or still, I understand that you were doing on a different story, but this connection to Dmytro Firtash, because in this recent publication, it's openly mentioned that they, at some point, represented the interest of Dmytro Firtash in the US. And by the way, something interesting probably to mention that recently Dmytro Firtash, who was there was still the part of the decision to extradite him to the United States, that he started to kind of fuel more information into this conspiracy theory about Biden, shocking, like all of a sudden, we understand that Firtash wants to buy some, influence in the US because he's going to face the trial there. But, so what we can, say about these connections?
So as I already mentioned, that basically Parnas and Fruman had a meeting with Kolomoisky in Israel. And the thing is, Kolomoisky is saying that initially that meeting was supposed to be about liquefied gas, about this company, which were supposed to basically conduct the business between US and Ukraine, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if they will go to Firtash with the same kind of affair, you know what I mean? It's not exposed, but we now know that Firtash recently hired new lawyer, Victoria Tosin, who used to work with Trump also, with Trump administration. And so he hired very influential lawyers who had good connections with White House. And I wouldn't be surprised if if Parnas and Fruman had the same deal or were offering the same deal to Firtash, give us money and we will organize this gas business, you know what I mean?
You managed to talk to Parnas, yeah? How did he sound?
That was not me who was talking with Parnas. There was my colleague, Michael Salah, who went to Miami a lot of times to meet personally Parnas and to convince him to talk on record, and then later to meet him in Washington. So he had a lot of meetings with Parnas. And with any other protagonist in the story, or with any other shady person, we have to double check all the information that we are receiving. So surprisingly, Parnas was very cooperative and he gave us a lot of information. For example, he mentioned that they had a meeting also in Ukraine with Bakanov and Shafir.
These are at that time, I don't know, they are the closest to the President Zelensky circle.
Yes, they're very close to Zelensky, and basically they confirmed that they both confirmed that this meeting actually happened, and that...
I would clarify, that was this meeting in spring, when they still wanted to...
That was the meeting between first and second round of the election.
So when he was not yet elected?
He was not yet elected, but it was obviously that he will be the next president, yes, because the support was huge back then.
So thanks a lot, and I would also say to our audience, at this stage, at this point, the scandal is there, but a lot of great journalists has already written a lot about that, had background, so you can still, if you haven't had a chance earlier, read this this investigation about who are Igor Fruman and Lev Parnas, what they were doing here, what their business, and also follow the news stories which definitely would be updated. In Poland, a Law and Justice party is expected to win even more votes than in 2015, according to the preliminary polls, those done prior to the election day, which is taking place today. In Warsaw, my colleague Sashko Shevchenko is covering the parliamentary elections in our neighboring country. So, good evening.
Good evening, Natalia. Nice to hear you.
So you were working for a couple of days there. Let us know what are the results expected. I know the people are still should be voting, but it looks like there is no major surprise that the race is not too close.
Yes, exactly. So there shouldn't be any surprise, even given that the Law and Justice Party, which is the ruling party right now, might have even more votes. It's still below 50%, but according to a very specific system of counting of votes in Poland, that will be more than enough to form an absolute majority in the parliament and therefore form a government by itself with no other parties included involved. So the PiS is very likely to go on governing the country by itself, and this is what the preliminary polls suggest, and we still will. The exit polls will be released at 9 p.m. According to a local time. But as for the turnout, it is on the level which is very traditional, so not quite above 50% of the turnout. So no surprise expected, at least as of the moment.
So what were the main topics and the issues for these elections? We understood that a lot of people supported the Law and Justice, or PiS in Polish, party for quite huge subsidies and support for the poor. Some critics say that they are bad for the Polish economy. We also know that this party is openly, ideologically conservative. So what were the main issues for people the parties were advocating?
Yes, so the electorate, the majority of voters that vote for PiS are actually located in the distant regions, not big cities. These are the people who are mostly interested in the farming, and they have big families, and those are the families that actually benefit from the subsidies, which include the 13th pension for the retired people. They include the zero tax for the younger generation, so if you are younger than 26, you don't pay the full tax, and of course the program Family 500 Plus, which in which the government gives 500 zloty each month for every child. So these are the subsidies that PiS is giving out for the allowances that people can benefit from, and therefore this might be the explanation why PiS keeps being very popular. Even though the initiatives that that the PiS is pursuing are not just conservative, they not only touch on the church that is very connected to the governing party, and they also have to take that into account, and not also their stances on the women rights, the abortion laws, which are already one of the most strictest in Europe, but also the distorting the democracy and the judiciary reform that has been criticized in the EU and also by the opposition, that actually threatens the independence of courts, the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Tribunal, and also the general courts all over the country. And the analysts say that the second term, if PiS wins, they'll probably use to close the system enough so they will not need to care that much about their popularity anymore. Because as you've mentioned, the economic, which has been growing during the term of PiS, might start decreasing soon, and there soon might be a crisis because of not quite working economy policies that peace used to apply within this time.
How the analysts there explain why the pro-EU civic coalition and the Polish opposition is generally doing that bad, because you listen for a couple of years, so many violations, threats to the Polish democracy, quite a lot of discussion about that, and in the end it looks like the opposition hadn't gained much. So how it's explained, if to be concise?
Well, one of the possible explanation it might be the lack of a charismatic leadership, because, for instance, the most popular opposition party, the Civic Coalition, was once founded by the current president of the European Council, Donald Tusk, who used to be very popular in Poland, but now he is more involved in European politics. On the other hand, the current leader, Grzegorz Schetyna, is not that popular, and therefore, even in the election campaign, he promised to step down, not to even be one of the candidates for the position of prime minister, because he realizes his toxicity, that he's not the most popular politician. That's actually the same thing that Jarosław Kaczynski did within PiS. When PiS was elected, one of the promises was that Kaczynski will not be the prime minister, and that is not the case now. So the prime minister is a different person, Mateusz Morawiecki. And this is why might be one of the problems with the civil coalition. The other problem is that the opposition parties, there is a scenario where they could unite together and try to run in these elections together, as they actually did in the European elections for the European Parliament this May. But analysts say that that might not work. They're too different ideologically. They have different electorate, different people who vote for them, and there might be also a problem. And again, coming again to the electoral system, the biggest party benefit more from the votes that were for the parties that didn't pass the threshold. So, for instance, all the results from the opposition parties altogether might be still less than the PiS itself.
So thanks a lot, Sashko, for explaining that to us. I encourage you also to follow up the story on our webpage, en.hromadske.ua, on our social media, which are there for you 24/7. Why also I should say that in order we exist, in order we cover Ukraine and Eastern Europe, we need your support, and particularly we encourage you to donate to Hromadske International. You can find the button at en.hromadske.ua webpage, so you can transfer some, let's say, even modest funds, and that would be extremely helpful to us. And I'll be back in a second. For the 5 years in a row, Hromadske is the information partner for one of the largest security conferences in Eastern Europe, which takes place in Latvia. It's a Riga Conference. And this year we also were happy to support their discussions with letting know what was discussed there, a lot about the security and defense in Europe. While my colleague, Olga Tokariuk, this year traveled to Riga, and just now he has brought quite a few incredible exclusive interviews. So in particular, we talked to the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Alexander Verzhbo, who pointed out the understanding Trump sees to have of Ukraine. At the same time, what he said, nothing that the US president's advice given to Zelensky to talk to Putin directly might not be so bad.
First of all, that President Macron's idea of opening up relations with Russia is a bit premature, given that Russia has not done anything concrete to justify any easing of the pressure on Moscow. And of course, there's no justification for pressure on Ukraine, but I think both Paris and Berlin still can play a helpful role if they work closely with Ukraine on seeing whether this agreement on using the Steinmeier formula provides an opening to some kind of improvement in the situation on the ground in the Donbas. I think there's been a lot of confusion about the Steinmeier formula. And some of it may have been exacerbated by the Ukrainian leadership. I think it wasn't presented very clearly when it first rolled out. It first appeared in the Russian media. But I think that the clarifications from President Zelenskyy, from Minister Pristaiko, that there'll be no elections in Donbas until the Russian troops are out, the militias are disarmed, and Ukraine has control of the border, I think, for me, reassures me that the right version of the Steinmeier formula is now on the table. Now, whether Russia wants to pick it up, I'm more skeptical. I think Russia was hoping to use this to alter the intent of the Minsk agreements, to have elections before Russian troops depart, and I think that is no basis for progress on Minsk or on free and fair elections. The fears are justified. I hope the worst does not come to pass. I mean, the bipartisan support is still very solid in the United States for Ukraine. The administration now is in a state of confusion and turmoil as the impeachment inquiry proceeds, as some of the unfortunate efforts to coerce Ukraine, both on the issue of investigating the Bidens, even holding hostage a meeting with the President of the United States for the sake of reinitiating these kinds of investigations inside Ukraine. All that's very unfortunate. But I hope that the administration, including the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, will kind of steer things back towards the right kind of policy and recognize that Ukraine remains a target of Russian aggression, remains a victim, and deserves our support. For me, the worst part of this whole episode was seeing in the transcript of the phone call that President Trump said absolutely nothing about Ukraine's security and its future independence and sovereignty. And this obviously sent a signal to Vladimir Putin that was very unhelpful. But hopefully the ship will right itself, and the policy of the administration will be reaffirmed in favor of Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. Yeah, I don't know for sure exactly what real understanding President Trump has of the conflict. He does seem to have something of a black spot when it comes to understanding Ukraine. He only talks about corruption rather than looking at the successes that Ukraine has made in the last 5 years in instituting reforms, actually fighting corruption, even though there's a long way to go. So at the same time, Trump is clearly a believer in face-to-face negotiations with the top leadership, and I think President Zelenskyy has shown that he wants to have a channel to Putin. So that's not necessarily bad advice from President Trump. The clear thing is that President Zelenskyy needs the clear backing of Washington, Berlin, Paris, and indeed all of our European allies, and let's throw in Canada as well, which I think can play a big role, and not be kind of sent into the lion's den all by himself. But direct talks with Putin may be part of the solution. I think one question that's not been addressed is what will be Russia's responsibility for paying for some of the reconstruction, given that most of the destruction is its responsibility. It has looted industries and moved factories to Russia. I think that sanctions should not be fully lifted until Russia pays up for the damage that it has done. That may be also a lesson regarding Crimea.
What are the risks Ukraine is facing going to the Normandy format meeting, and also as well, what effect can Ukraine expect in the US-Ukraine relations, taking into the account the recent scandal? There are a lot of views, so we are also suggesting you to hear from the renowned British journalist Edward Lucas, who is currently a vice president of the Center for European Policy.
Our new President Zelenskyy is promising to bring peace. He basically made it a cornerstone of his agenda, and he seems on the way to meeting Vladimir Putin again, and Angela Merkel and President of France Emmanuel Macron in the Normandy 4 summit. What do you think are the risks? What should he beware of? Or do you expect there will be a significant pressure on him and maybe the European allies also in a way standing by Russian agenda?
I think there are risks. I think one risk is that Ukraine is pushed by the West into making a bad deal. I think there's also a danger that Ukraine is pushed by Ukraine into making a bad deal. And the big thing for me is not so much what are the terms of the, say we have a ceasefire in the east, maybe the question of Crimea is postponed for a decade or longer. These are all reasonable potential political compromises, and it's up to Ukrainians if they want them. The question is, what does Russia do next? And my worry is that Russia's long-term interest is in destabilizing Ukraine, and that the eastern territories will be used as a continual kind of wound, an economic and political irritant for Ukraine, and that Russia's interests here are not sincere. So I worry about that. But I think I'm against outsiders telling Ukraine to be tough, because I think Ukraine has been tough and the outsiders didn't help. And we are in no position to advise you to take more casualties and more suffering and more economic losses when we didn't help you. This is fundamentally a question for Ukraine to decide, and the Ukrainian president has a huge mandate, and that's the thing about democracy. You elect leaders and they do things.
Ukraine now has also been against its own will in the center of the political scandal, political storm in the United States. Do you think that might have an impact on the US support, on the US bipartisan support to Ukraine? There are some fears in Ukraine that it might be the case.
I think this is an absolute nightmare, because whatever you do, you offend someone very important. So if you cooperate with President Trump, you infuriate the Democrats, and you need the Democrats both in the future because they might be in government, and right now because Congress votes the money through for you. But if you annoy President Trump, well, he's the guy in charge. So it's a lose-lose situation, and I feel very sorry for Ukraine that you're in this. And I'm not sure you could have done anything differently. I don't think this wasn't Ukraine's fault. There's no point where you can say, well, that was a big mistake. You just got sucked into this.
What do you think Ukraine should do at this point? So it should just wait till the 2020 elections in the US with its fingers crossed?
I would suggest that you rename the NATO Operations Conference Center near Odessa as Fort Trump, and try and attract President Trump's attention with some bright, shiny thing that he will like, or rename the main...
You know, there is a cafe already somewhere in Ukraine called Trump.
Yes. Now, I would rename the road from the Borispol airport to Kiev Trump Highway. And you have to try and play this game and just do something that will make him, will attract his attention in a positive way, but that doesn't damage your standing with the Democrats.
So these small measures you think might help?
I'm being slightly flippant, but I think it's really difficult. I think that there are serious questions about Hunter Biden's involvement and Burisma generally, and Mr. Zlochevsky, and all these things are, and one could, if one wanted to be critical, one could say that this is the problem with running a corrupt political and economic system, is that it doesn't just damage you, it gives outsiders ways of attacking you as well. And if, it's a big if, but if this had never happened with the gas licenses and Burisma and so on, then Ukraine would not be so open to criticism. So I think there are things that are worth investigating here, but they are not things that President Trump should be using as part of his political fight against Joe Biden, who's still his likely rival in the presidential election. So I'm afraid I can offer you only sympathy, but not advice on this.
And should we expect Germany and France put more pressure on Kyiv in order to implement Minsk agreement after there was the agreement on so-called Steinmeier formula? On this, we also at Riga Conference talked to the German journalist, the political editor of the Bild, Julius Röpke.
Well, first of all, of course, it is very good that there is a Normandy 4 meeting on the highest level, because we have seen meetings on the foreign ministerial level, on the directorate level, but not on the leaders of state level for, I think, many years now. So it is very good that these people are talking again to each other. However, I think that the preconditions set for this meeting are a little bit faulty. Because as you mentioned, the Steinmeier formula was to be implemented was a precondition, which was, I think, brought up by Russia. It was not clearly stated, but Germany said that's a precondition, not by us, but by others. So probably it was Russia. And as you know, the Steinmeier formula leads to lots of discussions in Ukraine, even protests on the street. And I think the reason is that it is not clear what it does mean, because what it says itself is that there should be disengagement of forces, that there should be regional elections, and there should be a special status. So these are all points which are included in the Minsk agreements, but they are in the context of a wider Russian-Ukrainian peace process, meaning the withdrawal of foreign forces, mainly Russian forces, meaning the withdrawal of all heavy weapons from Ukrainian territory, not only from a certain corridor along the front, and of course regaining sovereignty of Ukraine over its borders. All these things are not talked about in the Steinmeier formula, which is why there's a big uncertainty now. And the Zelenskyy government has to say, yes, Steinmeier formula, but elections according to Ukrainian law, control over our border. And let's be serious, if you have elections to Ukrainian law and control over the Russian-Ukrainian border from the Ukrainian side, this is the fulfillment of Minsk. So the question is whether or not it's meaningful at all to say Steinmeier formula has to be implemented first and then we go to meet. Because the Steinmeier formula can only be implemented, I think, according to most Ukrainians, even the president knows this, if the so-called republics of Lugansk and Donetsk don't exist anymore. And this is not given, so that's why I think that this precondition is sort of tricky and also sort of cheating the partners in the process. However, if everyone agrees that the formula is sort of implemented or sort of agreed upon, and that's why they meet again at the highest level, that's a good thing. I think the German position has not changed much. We have, tough to say, but we have other problems than Ukraine. We have internal problems, we have refugee problems, we have problems with right-wing extremists, and all these problems cannot be solved and cannot be not solved or solved if something happens in eastern Ukraine or if Russia withdraws. So I think there's no big difference there. Also, as you might know, Germany is in the process of finishing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia. And this is also, as it seems, totally independent from whatever happens in Ukraine. So my point is that Germany has no intention right now to change its politics. I don't see another government, I don't see other ministers which are more pro-Russian, I don't see them right now. So I think our position is constant. France's position is changing, apparently. There was talk that Macron wants Mr. Putin back in the G7. There was talk about this. It's not clear if Mr. Trump invented this or if this really happened. But there are other signs. Just lately, the French foreign minister and defense minister being in Moscow discussing and laughing and having fun with these people there, which are not only responsible for the war in Ukraine with 13,000 deaths, but which are also responsible for the war in Syria, where Russia killed more than 7,000 people since the start of 2015 and displaced more than 3 million people, of which many are in Europe and in Germany right now. So I think, yes, France wants to take over the initiative, which is what Mr. Macron often tries. Let's think about the European army, for example, but it does not often materialize. So I think there is a motivation in France to take over the initiative, maybe even to pressure Germany, but I'm not sure that it's working.
So we talked a lot about the position of the US, Germany, France, and even to listen to the British journalists. But what we can expect, and Ukraine can expect from our allies in Eastern Central Europe, and we also talked about that with the Foreign Minister for Lithuania, Linkevičius.
in short, we would really commend everything, all efforts in order to implement Minsk, in order to reach peaceful solution, but we need really more details. And at the same time, we have to understand that anything what will be done shouldn't be done at the expense of the sovereignty of Ukraine. This is also an important factor, but I believe this is shared by many and by everybody, and this is the truth. So I cannot just positive assess what happened, because I need more information.
Mm-hmm. Do you expect there will be pressure, significant pressure on behalf of Germany and especially France during this Normandy 4 meeting, considering especially recent President Macron's initiative to relaunch relationship with Russia?
I don't know if pressure will be applied, how it could be done. It's not efficient way to conduct normal negotiations. So pressure is not something which should be used, in my view. Also, we should understand that suffering side is Ukraine. Ukraine is conducting in the war situation. Ukraine is undergoing reform process, and this is really not so easy to reach any agreement under pressure. I hope it will not be the case. I believe the encounter by itself it's useful, unless it doesn't lead anywhere, because the contacts sometimes create impression of something like process, but it's not leading anywhere. We have these precedents many times again, and I don't know how it will happen in this time. But in general, of course, re-engagement, contacts, efforts are commendable, but we can judge about the results only upon realization on the ground.
So what do you think the European Union can do? What security guarantees it can give to Ukraine that Russia will be somehow held accountable and will fulfill its obligations?
International monitoring is important. You're right. When you have no trust, it's impossible to agree on anything. And even if you agree, it's difficult to rely on any so to say implementation. So without international mediation or monitoring or whatever, it's impossible to do. How efficiently that will be done, it's another question. But no other way. And we have already a kind of stalemate. And definitely time is running and people are tired, I believe. Of course, they would like to have this peaceful solution, and this war is already too long, and victims too many, and this is really the reason. And also, as I said, economical situation not so good in order to feel the difference, and this is all in all creates the tension, and new leadership understands this responsibility, I believe. Very important to mobilize all resources and really to implement what was promised. And this is not only external aggression, also fight with corruption was mentioned, right? People probably will not forgive if, again, there will be no results. It was also said during the elections recently. So we see many challenges here. And we see also our role, but not as owners of the process, but as facilitators, and we would be happy to be.
And of course, the full version of those interviews you can find on our webpage, en.hromadske.ua. They've been published soon. And stay with us. Follow us on social media. And also we have now an audio version of the show, so you can just listen to it. And see you in a week.